Picture this: a man with a waxed moustache defying gravity, painting melting clocks in a desert landscape, while claiming he remembered being in his mother's womb. Salvador Dali didn't just create art. He turned his entire existence into a performance so bizarre, so calculated, so absolutely mad that reality itself seemed to bend around him. By the time he died, he'd convinced the world that genius and insanity were the same thing. But here's what nobody tells you about Dali. The madness was a costume. Behind the theatrical persona was a frightened child from a small Spanish town, haunted by a dead brother he never met, desperate to prove he existed at all. Everything that came after, the paintings, the publicity stunts, the outrageous claims, was one man's lifelong attempt to answer a single question. Am I real? We're about to trace that answer from a fishing village on the Costa Brava to the heights of international fame, and back down into a darkness so complete it would consume everything he'd built. This isn't a story about art, it's about what happens when someone decides that being unforgettable is worth any price. The town of Figueres sits in Catalonia, close enough to the French border that you can almost taste the difference in the air. In 1904, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where scandals echoed for generations, and where a notary's family was expected to maintain certain standards. Salvador Dali and QC, the notary, had married Felipa Domènech Ferrer, and together they seemed destined for a respectable, unremarkable life. Then their first son died. Salvador Galo Anselmo Dali died at 21 months old from gastroenteritis. He'd been born exactly 9 months before the Salvador we know. The parents were shattered. Felipa especially couldn't recover from the loss. The boy had been perfect, brilliant even at that age, or so the story went. The kind of child parents build entire futures around. 9 months after his death, almost to the day, Felipa gave birth to another son. They named him Salvador Domènech Felipe Jacint Dali e Domènech, the exact same name as the dead brother. Not similar, identical. Think about that for a second. You're born into a space still warm from someone else's death. Your name isn't yours. Your parents look at you and see a ghost. Every time they call you to dinner, they're speaking to a memory. The second Salvador grew up in a house where his brother's photograph hung on the wall, where people spoke about the first Salvador's brilliance, his beauty, his promise, all in past tense while looking at the replacement standing right there. Dali would later claim his parents took him to his brother's grave when he was 5 and told him he was the reincarnation. Whether this actually happened or became true in the telling doesn't matter. He believed it. He wrote about it. He painted it. The dead brother became the foundation of everything. His parents weren't cruel. They were grieving people doing what grieving people do, trying to bring back what they'd lost. But imagine being the vessel for someone else's resurrection. Imagine knowing that your existence is both a comfort and a constant reminder of failure. You can't bring back the dead. You can only approximate them. Salvador dealt with this the only way that made sense. If he couldn't be the first Salvador, he'd be so completely, overwhelmingly himself that no one would ever confuse him with anyone else. If the world wanted to see a ghost, he'd show them something they'd never forget. The signs showed up early. He wasn't just difficult, he was theatrical about it. He'd throw himself down staircases for attention. He'd kick other children, then claim elaborate justifications. He'd scream until he vomited if he didn't get what he wanted. His sister, Ana Maria, born 3 years after him, learned quickly to stay out of his way. But here's where it gets interesting. He was also drawing. Constantly. Obsessively. His father, despite everything, recognized talent when he saw it. Salvador Dali y Cusi was a rationalist, an atheist, a man of law and order. He should have beaten the nonsense out of his son. Instead, he gave him a studio space in the family's summer house at Cadaqués. Cadaqués. Remember this name. It's where everything that matters in Dali's early life happened. A fishing village on the Mediterranean, all white buildings and crystalline light, tucked into the rocky coast where the Pyrenees meet the sea. The landscape there doesn't look quite real. The rocks are ancient, twisted into impossible shapes. The light is so clear, it hurts. The wind, the tramontana, blows down from the mountains and drives people mad. Dali spent his summers there, painting the rocks, the water, the fishermen. His technique was already beyond his years. He wasn't just talented, he was possessed by it. While other children played, he painted. While they swam, he studied the way water reflected light. He was building an archive of images that would fuel his work for the next 70 years. His father hired a professor from the local school to give him proper instruction. Ramon Pichot was a successful painter himself, part of the artistic community in Paris, and he saw immediately that this strange child had something rare. He introduced young Salvador to Impressionism, to modern techniques, to the idea that art could be more than just copying reality. But Salvador was already thinking past that. He'd discovered philosophy through his father's library. He read Nietzsche, Kant, Spinoza, absorbing ideas he couldn't fully understand, but that resonated with his growing sense that reality was negotiable. If philosophers could argue about whether the world was real, why couldn't he paint it differently? School was torture. Not because he couldn't do the work, he was brilliant when he wanted to be, but because it required conformity. He'd show up in bizarre outfits. He'd refuse to answer questions he found beneath him. He'd hand in assignments that were technically perfect, but deliberately strange. Teachers didn't know what to do with him. The other students definitely didn't know what to do with him. He was small, effeminate in manner, with a voice that never quite deepened. He didn't fight back when they mocked him. He just stared at them with those enormous eyes until they got uncomfortable and left him alone. He was learning something crucial. Being weird was a kind of power if you committed to it completely. At 14, his mother died. Felipe Dali succumbed to cancer, and Salvador's world fractured in a different way. She'd been the one person who loved him without trying to change him. She'd defended his eccentricities to her husband. She'd encouraged his art. Without her, the house became a battlefield. His father remarried quickly, too quickly, to Felipe's sister, Tieta. Salvador never forgave him for this. In his mind, his father had replaced his mother the same way Salvador had replaced his dead brother. The pattern was complete. Everyone was replaceable. No one was permanent. Except art. Art was permanent. Paint dried and stayed. Canvas didn't die. And if you were good enough, if you were brilliant enough, if you were unforgettable enough, you could make yourself permanent too. At 16, Salvador Dali enrolled at the Academia de Bellas Artes de San Fernando in Madrid. This was 1922, and Madrid was alive with new ideas. The remnants of the old empire were crumbling. Young artists, writers, and intellectuals were gathering to figure out what came next. Spain was trying to modernize, to join the 20th century, and the art school was at the center of it all. Dali arrived dressed like a dandy from another era. Long hair, wide-brimmed hat, knee breeches, stockings, a cape. He looked like he'd stepped out of a Velázquez painting. This wasn't ignorance of fashion, it was a statement. While everyone else was trying to be modern, Dali was claiming the entire history of Spanish art as his inheritance. The other students thought he was insane. Then they saw him paint. His technical skill was already beyond most of his professors. He could render reality with photographic precision. He understood light, composition, anatomy, all the classical skills that took others years to develop. But he wasn't interested in just being good. He was studying everything: cubism, futurism, metaphysical painting, absorbing techniques and discarding them, looking for something that didn't exist yet. He found his people quickly. The Residencia de Estudiantes was where the brightest minds in Spain lived while studying in Madrid. Dali moved in and discovered a world he'd never imagined. Poets, filmmakers, musicians, all of them young, all of them brilliant, all of them convinced they were going to change the world. Two people there would alter the course of his life. The first was Federico Garcia Lorca, already writing poetry that made grown men weep. Lorca was everything Dali wasn't: warm, emotionally open, beloved by everyone who met him. He saw something in the strange Catalan painter and decided they would be friends. More than friends, actually. Lorca fell in love with Dali, wrote poems about him, followed him around like a puppy. Dali didn't know what to do with this. He'd never had a close friend before. He'd certainly never been loved by someone as magnetic as Lorca. He was attracted to Lorca's talent, his intensity, but romantically, sexually, that terrified him. Dali's relationship with his own body was already complicated. The idea of physical intimacy with anyone made him anxious in ways he couldn't articulate, but he kept Lorca close anyway. He needed the connection, even if he couldn't reciprocate it. They talked for hours about art, about poetry, about changing the world. Lorca introduced him to the avant-garde literary scene. Dali painted portraits of Lorca, tender images that suggested more than he could say out loud. The second person was Luis Buñuel, a filmmaker from Aragon with a cruel streak and a hatred of sentimentality. Where Lorca was all emotion, Buñuel was ice. He made fun of Lorca's poetry, called it bourgeois nonsense. He and Dali bonded over their contempt for conventional art, for the safe and the pretty. Buñuel was making films, or trying to. He understood that cinema was the future, that you could do things with a camera that painting couldn't touch. He needed images that would shock people out of their complacency. Dali started giving him ideas, disturbing ideas. An eye being sliced open, dead donkeys on pianos, ants crawling out of a hand. This was the triangle: Lorca offering love, Buñuel offering nihilism, and Dali in the middle, absorbing both, committing to neither. He was learning to take what he needed from people without giving himself away. It was a skill that would serve him well and destroy him completely. But first he had to get expelled from art school. In 1926, Dali's professors informed him he would need to take his final exams. He'd been at the academia for 4 years. He'd completed all the coursework. This should have been a formality. Instead, Dali announced that he refused to be examined by professors who weren't qualified to judge him. Think about the arrogance of that statement. This 22-year-old student declaring that his teachers, established artists with decades of experience, weren't good enough to evaluate his work. The administration didn't take it well. They expelled him. His father was furious. Salvador Dali Oikusi had spent money he didn't really have to send his son to Madrid's finest art school, and the boy had thrown it away out of pride. There were screaming matches, threats of disinheritance. Salvador didn't care. He'd already learned what he needed from the academia: the technical skills, the connections, the exposure to new ideas. A diploma was just paper. He went back to Figueres and set up a studio. If the establishment wouldn't accept him on his terms, he'd force them to accept him on his terms. He painted furiously, developing a style that mixed classical technique with cubist fragmentation, with metaphysical strangeness, with something uniquely his own. The paintings from this period are unsettling. Figures with elongated limbs, faces that are both realistic and distorted, landscapes that feel like fever dreams. He was working out his obsessions on canvas: the dead brother, his own identity, his fear of physical intimacy, his attraction to decay and putrefaction. His father looked at these paintings and saw madness. His sister Anna Maria posed for many of them, patient as always, watching her brother disappear into whatever private hell he was documenting. The people of Figueres whispered about the notary's strange son, who'd been kicked out of art school and now spent his days painting nightmares. But word was spreading in the right circles. Gallery owners in Barcelona were hearing about this young Catalan painter who was doing something different. Critics were curious. In 1925, Dali had his first solo exhibition in Barcelona. It sold out, every painting gone. bought by collectors who saw the future in those disturbed images. He was 21 years old and he'd proven something crucial. You didn't need the establishment's approval if you were good enough. You just needed to be so undeniably talented that they had to pay attention whether they wanted to or not. And Dali was just getting started. He hadn't even discovered surrealism yet. He hadn't met the woman who would become his obsession, his muse and his destruction. He hadn't painted the melting clocks or declared himself a genius or built his own museum or any of the things we associate with Salvador Dali. All of that was coming, but first he needed to go to Paris. Paris in 1926 was everything Figueres wasn't. 7 million people instead of 7,000. The Eiffel Tower instead of church steeples. Cafes where artists argued about the death of God instead of the price of olives. Dali stepped off the train at Gare d'Orsay with 50 francs and a letter of introduction to Pablo Picasso. He was 22 years old. He'd never left Spain before, and he was absolutely certain he belonged here more than anywhere else on earth. The letter was from Joan Miró, the Catalan painter who'd already made it in Paris. Miró had seen Dali's work in Barcelona and recognized something. Not just talent, everyone had talent, but hunger. The specific kind of hunger that makes a person willing to burn everything down to get what they want. So Miró wrote to Picasso, "I am bringing you a young Catalan who seems to have fire in his belly. Do what you want with him." Dali went to Picasso's studio the next day, 45 years old, already the most famous living artist in the world. Picasso didn't usually have time for unknown painters from provincial Spanish towns. But he made time for this one. Dali brought a small painting under his arm. Something recent, something that showed what he could do. He didn't bring his best work because he wanted Picasso to see potential, not finished achievement. It was calculated. Everything was always calculated. Picasso looked at the painting for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he looked at Dali. "You paint like an old master," Picasso said, "but you think like a madman. I don't know if that's good or bad yet." It was the best thing anyone had ever said to him. They talked for 2 hours. Picasso showed him his current work. Dali pretended to understand the Cubist experiments better than he did. He asked intelligent questions. He made Picasso laugh twice. By the time he left, he'd been invited back. One meeting with Picasso and suddenly doors opened. Gallery owners who wouldn't return Miró's calls were interested in the young Catalan. Critics who'd never heard of Figueres were asking to see more work. But Dali wasn't ready yet. He knew it even if nobody else did. He spent 3 weeks in Paris visiting every museum, every gallery, every studio he could talk his way into. He saw paintings by Matisse and Braque and Juan Gris. He saw African masks that had inspired Picasso's revolution. He saw the latest work by the surrealists, those lunatics who claimed they could paint dreams. And he realized something that would change everything. The Cubists were finished. They'd done something revolutionary 20 years ago, but now they were just repeating themselves. The metaphysical painters like de Chirico were interesting but limited. Even Picasso, for all his genius, was starting to feel like yesterday's news. But the surrealists, these people were onto something. They'd published their manifesto 2 years earlier. André Breton, the self-appointed pope of surrealism, had declared that art should bypass conscious control entirely. Automatic writing, dream imagery, the unconscious mind unleashed onto the canvas. It was pretentious. It was ridiculous. It was exactly what Dali had been doing his whole life without knowing there was a name for it. He went back to Figueres with a mission. He would become the greatest surrealist who ever lived. Not by following Breton's rules. Dali didn't follow anyone's rules, but by taking the basic idea and pushing it further than anyone else dared. Paint the unconscious? Fine. But do it with the technical precision of Vermeer. Make the impossible look more real than reality. Turn nightmares into photographs. For the next 2 years, he barely left his studio. He painted rocks that floated, figures that melted, landscapes that seemed normal until you noticed the details, the tiny impossibilities that made your brain reject what your eyes were seeing. His father watched this obsession with growing alarm. Salvador had given up on his son getting a respectable job, but he'd at least hoped the boy would paint things people wanted to buy. Instead, Salvador was painting rotting donkeys and grasshoppers crawling out of human hands. "You'll starve," his father told him. "Then I'll be a thin genius instead of a fat mediocrity," Dali replied. Their relationship was deteriorating. It had been strained since the art school expulsion, but now it was approaching open warfare. Salvador Dali Arcusi wanted his son to be successful, yes, but within normal boundaries. Make money, get married, produce grandchildren, die respected by the neighbours. His son wanted to be immortal. Ana Maria was caught in the middle. She loved her brother, but she could see what he was becoming. More arrogant, more cruel, more willing to hurt people if it served his purposes. She kept posing for his paintings though, hours at a time, standing or sitting while he worked with that manic intensity, muttering to himself, occasionally laughing at private jokes. "What are you laughing at?" she asked once. "Everything," he said, "the whole ridiculous world." In 1928, Dali was invited to participate in a group show in Barcelona. Nothing major, just a chance to exhibit alongside other young Spanish painters. But Dali didn't do anything small. He submitted a painting called The Basket of Bread. Photographic realism. A wicker basket containing 4 pieces of bread, painted with such precision you could count the threads in the weave. It looked like he'd abandoned all the surrealist experimentation and gone back to classical technique. The critics were baffled. Some called it a masterpiece, others said he was wasting his talent on still lifes when he could be doing something bold. They all missed the point. Dali wasn't abandoning surrealism. He was proving he could paint like Vermeer when he wanted to. So when he painted melting watches or elongated elephants on spider legs, nobody could dismiss it as lack of skill. He could do classical realism in his sleep. He chose to paint nightmares. The painting sold for more money than his father made in 3 months. And something else happened at that exhibition. Something that would matter more than any sale. A woman saw his work. Her name was Gala. She was 34 years old, Russian by birth, married to the surrealist poet Paul Eluard. She had dark eyes and sharp cheekbones, and an intensity that made people uncomfortable. She stood in front of Dali's paintings for 20 minutes. Then she asked the gallery owner who'd painted them. "A young Catalan," he said. "Salvador Dali, mad as a hatter but extraordinarily talented." "I want to meet him," Gala said. "He's not here. He went back to Figueres." "Then I'll go to Figueres." The gallery owner laughed. Nobody went to Figueres. It was a nothing town in Catalonia, hours from anywhere that mattered. But Gala wasn't joking. She convinced her husband to take her to Cadaque, the fishing village near Figueres where Dali's family had a summer house. It wasn't hard to convince him. Paul Eluard collected artists the way some people collected stamps. He wanted to meet this strange young Spaniard who painted like his unconscious mind had exploded onto the canvas. They arrived in August 1929. Dali was 25. Gala was 35. He'd never had a serious relationship with a woman. His sexual experience was limited to fumbling attempts that had gone nowhere. He was terrified of physical intimacy, convinced his body was disgusting, certain he would humiliate himself. She'd been married twice, had a daughter, had affairs with half the artists in Paris. She knew exactly what she was doing with men, and she did it without sentiment. They met on the beach at Cadaque. Dali had prepared for this meeting obsessively. He'd shaved his armpits, convinced the hair was revolting. He'd perfected his moustache, waxing it into points that defied gravity. He'd chosen his outfit carefully. A torn shirt, a pearl necklace he'd stolen from his mother's jewellery box, cologne mixed with goat dung and fish glue, because he'd read somewhere that strong smells attracted women. He smelled like a garbage fire. Gala didn't care. She looked at him, and saw exactly what she'd been searching for without knowing it. A genius she could mould, a talent she could manage, a man-child she could control completely while he thought he was in charge. Dali looked at her and saw his dead brother. Not literally, but he saw the same thing he'd been searching for in that photograph his parents kept on the wall. The missing piece, the other half, the person who would make him complete. They barely spoke that first day, just stared at each other across the beach while Paul Eluard talked about poetry and the other guests pretended not to notice the tension. That night, Dali couldn't sleep. He painted until dawn, a canvas he'd later call the Great Masturbator. A grotesque head in profile, eyes closed, a grasshopper crawling across the face, a woman's figure emerging from the skull. It was the most sexually explicit thing he'd ever painted. It was also completely about Gala, even though he'd only met her hours before. The next morning she came to his studio alone. "Show me what you painted last night," she said. He showed her. She studied it for 5 minutes. Then she looked at him. "You're a virgin, aren't you?" Most men would have lied. Dali told the truth. "Yes, that's fine," Gala said. "I prefer it that way. Less to unteach." They became inseparable immediately. Not lovers yet, Dali was too terrified for that, but something deeper than lovers. Collaborators, co-conspirators, two people who recognized in each other the same bottomless need for attention and control. Paul Eluard watched his wife fall in love with this strange Spanish boy and did nothing to stop it. Some people said he didn't care. Others said he understood he'd already lost her the moment she decided she wanted something. Gala always got what she wanted. By September, she'd left her husband and moved in with Dali. Not officially, not yet, but everyone knew. The scandal was immediate and delicious. A married woman abandoning her husband and child for a penniless painter, 10 years younger, who still lived with his father. Salvador Dali, Oshikusi, was apoplectic. His son was destroying the family's reputation, shacking up with a divorced Russian woman, painting obscenities, making a spectacle of himself. "You'll end this immediately," he told Salvador. "No," Salvador said. It was the first time he'd ever refused his father a direct command. The confrontation that followed was nuclear. His father threatened disinheritance. Salvador laughed. His father called Gala a whore. Salvador defended her with viciousness that surprised them both. "She's the only person who's ever understood me," he said. "She's using you," his father said. "Good," Salvador replied. "I'm using her too." And he was. Gala was teaching him how to perform genius instead of just being talented, how to manipulate the press, how to turn outrage into publicity, how to make people pay attention even when they didn't want to. She was also teaching him about sex, though that was a slower process. Dali's terror of physical intimacy didn't disappear overnight, but Gala was patient when she needed to be. She understood that controlling Salvador Dali required understanding his fears, not dismissing them. By the end of 1929, everything had changed. Dali had his first solo show in Paris, arranged by Gala's connections. The paintings were explosive. The lugubrious game featured a figure with excrement-stained underwear. The Great Masturbator made its public debut. Critics called them obscene, brilliant, revolting, revolutionary. André Breton, the Pope of Surrealism, had to admit this Spanish upstart was doing something none of them had managed. Making the unconscious visible with such technical precision, it couldn't be dismissed as mere chaos. But Breton was also suspicious. Dali was too calculated, too aware of the effect he was having. True surrealism was supposed to be automatic, spontaneous, free from conscious control. Dali's surrealism felt like performance art. Because it was. Gala understood this immediately. While other surrealists were trying to bypass consciousness, Dali was weaponizing it. And she knew that's what would make him famous. The break with his father became final in early 1930. Salvador Dali Ikusi had tolerated the paintings, barely. He tolerated the Paris shows, But when Salvador shaved his head and showed up at a family gathering with Gala on his arm, wearing a rotting fish as a boutonniere, something snapped. "You're no son of mine," his father said. Salvador smiled. "Finally, something we agree on." The disinheritance was absolute. No money, no support, no family home to return to. Dali was 25 years old and completely on his own. Most people thought he'd crawl back within months. They didn't understand what Gala had already figured out. Salvador Dali didn't need his father anymore. He'd found something better, a partner who believed in his mythology more than he did. She became his manager, his dealer, his publicist, his editor, his lover when he could manage it, and his mother when he needed that instead. She negotiated with galleries, she courted collectors, she made sure Salvador ate, she kept track of money, something he'd never bothered with, and most importantly, she amplified the persona they were building together. The mad genius, the provocateur, the painter who could make you uncomfortable just by looking at you. By 1931, they'd moved to Port Ligat, a tiny fishing village near Kadake. They bought a shack, barely habitable, and began transforming it into something that matched Dali's internal landscape. White walls, strange angles, rooms that connected in unexpected ways. A house that felt like walking through one of his paintings. Money was still tight, but Gala had connections. Rich Americans were starting to collect surrealism. The market was there if you knew how to work it, and Gala knew how to work everything. She also knew Salvador needed to be protected from himself. His paranoia was getting worse. He'd become convinced that groups of people were plotting against him. Sometimes the plots were real. The surrealists did resent his success, but often they existed only in his head. Gala would sit with him during these episodes, letting him talk through the conspiracy theories until he exhausted himself. Then she'd bring him back to reality with brutal efficiency. None of that matters. What matters is the work. Are you painting? Usually he wasn't. The paranoia paralyzed him, so she'd physically walk him to the easel, put a brush in his hand, and stand there until he started working. Sometimes it took hours, but she never left. This was the pattern of their life together. Salvador would spiral into madness. Gala would pull him out. Salvador would have a brilliant idea. Gala would figure out how to sell it. Salvador would create something. Gala would make sure the world paid attention. It wasn't love, in any conventional sense. It was something stranger and more durable, symbiosis, two people who needed each other's pathologies to function. The painting from this period shows the evolution. The Persistence of Memory was completed in 1931, allegedly in a single afternoon. The famous melting clocks draped over a dead tree, over a distorted face, over the edge of a platform. Time itself becoming soft and unreliable. Dali claimed the image came to him while staring at melting camembert cheese after dinner. This was probably true. His best ideas usually came from staring at something mundane until it became terrifying. But the painting's power came from something else. The technical precision. Every soft clock was rendered with photographic accuracy. The rocks in the background looked solid enough to touch. The ants crawling over one clock were individually detailed. This wasn't dream logic painted sloppily. This was nightmare rendered with the care of a Dutch master. Critics didn't know what to do with it. The image was instantly memorable, which bothered them. Surrealism wasn't supposed to be decorative, but there was something about those melting clocks that lodged in your brain and wouldn't leave. The painting sold quickly. The Museum of Modern Art in New York would eventually acquire it. At 27, Dali had created an image that would define surrealism for people who knew nothing else about the movement. André Breton was furious. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. The Surrealist revolution was about liberating the unconscious, not creating merchandise. But that's exactly what Dali was doing, and he wasn't hiding it. "I am surrealism," he told an interviewer in 1933. Not "I am a surrealist," not "I practice surrealism." I am surrealism. The movement and the man were identical in his mind. Breton called an emergency meeting. The surrealist group, what was left of it, gathered in a Paris cafe to discuss the Salvador Dali problem. He was making them all look like charlatans with his self-promotion. He was turning serious revolutionary art into spectacle. Dali showed up late, wearing a suit made of glass panels with a bra attached to the outside. He sat down and ordered champagne while everyone stared. "You're destroying everything we've built," Breton said. "I'm the only thing you've built that people care about," Dali replied. This was objectively true, which made it worse. Dali's shows were packed, his paintings sold, magazines wanted interviews. Meanwhile, other surrealists were still arguing about whether using conscious technique betrayed the movement's principles. "You're expelled," Breton finally said, effective immediately. "You're no longer a surrealist." Dali laughed so hard he choked on his champagne. "You can't expel me. I already told you, I am surrealism. You can expel yourselves if you want." He left the cafe and never looked back. The surrealists tried to pretend he'd never been one of them, but history wasn't interested in their version. When people thought of surrealism, they thought of melting clocks. They thought of Dali. Gala was delighted. "Now you don't have to share credit with anyone," she said. They were right. The expulsion was the best thing that could have happened. Now Dali could do whatever he wanted without worrying about movement politics. He could embrace commercialism. He could design department store windows. He could illustrate magazine covers. He could sell out completely and call it genius, which is exactly what he did. In 1934, he made his first trip to America. The crossing took a week. He spent most of it in his cabin, seasick and paranoid that the ship would sink. Gala stayed with him, bringing him bread and water, talking him through the terror. New York was everything Paris wasn't. Bigger, louder, more vulgar, more honest about money. Americans didn't care about artistic purity. They wanted entertainment, novelty, spectacle. Dali could deliver all three. His first major exhibition at the Julian Levy Gallery sold out. Rich collectors fought over paintings. The press coverage was massive. Dali gave interviews where he said outrageous things deliberately. "The only difference between me and a madman is that I am not mad." The quote appeared in dozens of newspapers. He was invited to parties where he'd show up in increasingly bizarre outfits. A cane topped with a doll's head, shoes with backwards heels. Once, a diving suit with a helmet he couldn't remove, nearly suffocating before someone found a wrench. The Americans ate it up. Here was European genius, performing itself for their amusement, and Dali was happy to perform. He'd figured out something the other surrealists hadn't. Being an artist wasn't enough. You had to be a brand. Gala managed every detail. She negotiated with galleries, arranged interviews, made sure Salvador didn't actually die during one of his publicity stunts. She also started raising prices systematically. A Dali painting cost more every year, not because the work was better, but because Gala understood artificial scarcity. "Never let them think they can afford you," she told him. "The moment you're accessible, you're worthless." She was right. By 1935, Dali was charging amounts that made other painters furious, and collectors paid without hesitating because owning a Dali meant something. It meant you were sophisticated enough to appreciate genius, wealthy enough to afford it, and brave enough to hang something genuinely disturbing in your home. The paintings from this period got stranger. Autumn Cannibalism showed two figures made of soft drawers eating each other with spoons and forks. Soft Construction with boiled beans depicted a monstrous figure tearing itself apart against a desert landscape. These weren't dreams, they were prophecies. Dali claimed he could see the Spanish Civil War coming before it started. This was probably retroactive mythology, but the violence in these paintings was real. Spain was about to tear itself apart, and somehow he'd captured that tension before anyone was willing to name it. When the war actually began in 1936, Dali was safely in America. He and Gala watched from a distance as Spain descended into chaos. His sister, Anna Maria was still there. So were friends from the academy. The news that reached them was sporadic and horrifying. Federico Garcia Lorca was arrested by nationalist forces in August 1936. He was driven to a field outside Granada and shot. His body was dumped in an unmarked grave. Dali heard the news 3 weeks later. He was at a party in New York when someone mentioned it casually, assuming he already knew. He didn't react, not then. He finished his drink, made excuses, and left with Gala. They went back to their hotel. Dali locked himself in the bathroom for 2 hours. Gala sat outside the door, listening to him cry. When he finally emerged, his face was calm, blank. "We're not going back," he said. "To the party? To Spain." And they didn't. Not for years. While Spain burned, Dali stayed in America and Europe, painting and selling and performing. Some people called him a coward. Others understood he was saving himself from a war that would have destroyed him. His sister, Anna Maria, never forgave him. She saw it as abandonment. Years later, she'd write a memoir painting Salvador as a monster who cared only about himself. Some of what she wrote was true, but she never understood that her brother's selfishness was what kept him alive. The late 30s were productive and empty at the same time. Dali painted constantly. The work was technically perfect and emotionally hollow, or maybe the emotion was just too buried to access. Spain appeared in several paintings as a woman with drawers pulled out of her torso, spilling the contents of her body across the landscape. He also started designing. Theatre sets, jewellery, furniture, book covers. If someone would pay him to create something, he'd do it. Gala encouraged this. Money was security, and security was survival. In 1938, he met Sigmund Freud in London. It was supposed to be a meeting of minds, the painter who visualized the unconscious and the doctor who'd mapped it. Dali was nervous for the first time in years. He brought a painting to show Freud, Metamorphosis of Narcissus. Freud studied it for 10 minutes in silence. Then he looked at Dali and said, "In classic paintings, I look for the unconscious. In yours, I look for the conscious." It was the most devastating compliment Dali ever received. Freud had seen through him completely. All the performance, all the mythology about accessing pure unconscious imagery, and Freud knew it was calculation. The mad genius was just a genius pretending to be mad. Dali left the meeting shaken. "He saw everything," he told Gala. "Good," she said. "That means you're doing it right." By 1939, Europe was preparing for another war. Dali and Gala decided to sit this one out too. They sailed for America and stayed there for 8 years. While the world destroyed itself, Salvador Dali sold paintings to millionaires and designed windows for Bonwit Teller. He was safe, he was successful, and he was completely irrelevant to anything that mattered. America during World War II was hungry for spectacle. People wanted distraction from the newsreels, from the casualty lists, from the creeping fear that civilization was eating itself. Salvador Dali gave them exactly what they needed. Not truth, not insight, entertainment. He arrived in New York in 1940 with Gala and 8 suitcases full of unfinished canvases. Within 6 months, he was the most talked about artist in the country. Not the most respected, the most talked about. There's a difference. The Museum of Modern Art gave him a retrospective in 1941. He was only 37 years old. Most artists wait decades for that kind of recognition. Dali got it while he was still young enough to enjoy it. The show was packed. People lined up around the block. They came to see the melting clocks, the elephants on spider legs, the burning giraffes. They came to see what madness looked like when you hung it on a wall and called it art. Critics were less enthusiastic. Some praised the technical skill. Everyone acknowledged he could paint. But the surrealist establishment, what was left of it, saw the show as proof that Dali had abandoned everything the movement stood for. André Breton had already expelled him from the group years earlier. Now he coined a new name for Salvador, A Vida Dollars, an anagram of his name that translated roughly to eager for dollars. It stuck because it was true. Dali didn't deny it. "The difference between me and the surrealists," he said, "is that I am a surrealist." When reporters asked what he meant, he'd smile and change the subject. The quote made perfect sense to him. Nobody else understood it, but that was the point. Money poured in. Dali painted portraits of wealthy Americans who wanted to own a piece of madness they could hang in their living rooms. He designed jewellery for the Duke of Windsor. He created a dream sequence for Alfred Hitchcock's film Spellbound. 7 minutes of painted backdrops and eyeballs, and scissors that Hitchcock mostly cut from the final film. Dali didn't care. He got paid. The department store work was particularly lucrative. Bonwit Teller commissioned him to design window displays. Dali filled them with mannequins in bizarre poses, bathtubs lined with fur, lobster telephones. Thousands of people stopped on Fifth Avenue to stare. Then the store changed one of his displays without permission. They thought it was too strange. They toned it down. Dali walked past the window, saw what they'd done, and went inside. He climbed into the display window and started smashing things. A bathtub crashed through the plate glass onto the sidewalk. Dali followed it through the broken window, landing on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by shattered glass and screaming pedestrians. The police arrested him. The newspapers loved it. Mad artist attacks department store. The judge fined him $500 and released him. Bonwit Teller paid the fine and commissioned 3 more displays. Controversy sold. Dali knew this better than anyone, but underneath the stunts and the showmanship, something was shifting. The paintings from this period are strange in a different way than the earlier work. They're more religious, more Catholic. Dali had never been devoutly religious, but now Christian imagery started appearing everywhere. Crucifixions, Madonnas, saints in ecstasy. Part of this was calculation. America was more religious than Europe. Religious themes sold, but part of it was genuine. The war had shaken something loose in Dali. All those people dying for ideologies, for nations, for ideas about how the world should be organised. And here he was painting melting watches for rich people. He told an interviewer in 1943 that surrealism had been about destroying everything. Now, he said, I want to build something. When they asked what, he didn't answer. He probably didn't know yet. Gala was changing too. She'd always been the practical one, the manager, the person who made sure Dali ate and slept and didn't destroy himself. But America had revealed something in her. She liked wealth. She liked security. She liked being Mrs. Salvador Dali more than she'd ever liked being a surrealist's muse. She started taking lovers, younger men usually. Dali knew and didn't care, or claimed he didn't care. Their relationship had never been conventional. She'd been married when they met. He'd been 25 and sexually inexperienced to the point of dysfunction. They'd built something that worked for them, and if that included Gala sleeping with other people, fine. What Dali couldn't handle was being alone. He needed Gala in the room, in the house, within reach. When she travelled without him, even for a day, he'd become anxious and unable to work. His dependence on her was absolute. She was the only person who'd ever made him feel safe. In 1945, the war ended. Europe began counting its dead. Dali and Gala stayed in America. There was no reason to go back yet. Spain was still under Franco. France was rebuilding. America was booming. The money was here. But something else was here too. A new generation of American artists who were about to make everything Dali had done look old-fashioned. Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Willem de Kooning. Abstract expressionism was rising, and it made surrealism look quaint. These painters weren't interested in dreams or symbols or technical skill. They wanted pure emotion, direct and unmediated. Dali saw what was happening and panicked, not publicly. He'd never admit panic publicly, but the paintings from 1946 and 1947 show it. They're bigger, more ambitious, more desperate. He was trying to prove he was still relevant, still the most important artist alive. The problem was nobody was asking the question anymore. Critics started calling him a has-been, a showman, a sellout who'd traded genius for celebrity. None of this was entirely unfair, but it also wasn't the whole story. Dali had always been a showman. That had never stopped him from being a genius before. The difference was that now people were bored of the show. In 1948, he painted The Elephants, impossibly tall elephants on spider legs, carrying obelisks across a desert. It's technically perfect. The anatomy is wrong on purpose. The proportions are dreamlike, and it feels completely empty. You look at it and think, yes, that's a Dali, nothing more. It could have been painted by an algorithm trained on his earlier work. He knew it. He'd look at these paintings in his studio and feel nothing. Then he'd sign them and ship them to galleries and smile for photographers. What else was there to do? Stop painting? Admit defeat? That wasn't an option. Dali had built an entire identity around being Salvador Dali. If he stopped performing that role, what would be left? Gala had an answer. We go back to Spain. Dali resisted. Franco was still in power. The Spain they'd left in 1936 was gone. Everyone they'd known was dead or scattered. What was there to go back to? Port Ligat, Gala said. The house. Oh, their house in Catalonia had somehow survived the war. It was damaged but standing. They could rebuild it, make it bigger, turn it into something extraordinary. A house that was itself a work of art. Dali warmed to the idea. America was suffocating him. Too much success, too much money. Too much of people asking for the same performance, over and over. Spain would be different. He could work, really work. Not just produce paintings for collectors, but explore something new. In 1949, they went back. The house in Port Ligat was worse than they'd imagined. The roof was half collapsed. The walls were cracked. Squatters had been living there. It smelled like mould and decay. Dali walked through the rooms in silence. Gala watched him, waiting. Finally, he turned to her and smiled. Perfect, he said. We'll rebuild everything. The reconstruction took years. Dali designed every detail. The entrance, the courtyard, the studio, each room connected to the next in ways that made no logical sense but felt exactly right. Doors that led nowhere, windows at strange angles, a giant egg on the roof, because why not? He worked on the house the way he used to work on paintings, obsessively, completely. It became his masterpiece in a way that no canvas could be. This was something he could live inside, something that would outlast him. While the house was being built, Dali painted. Smaller canvases now, more controlled. He was moving away from the melting clocks and burning giraffes towards something harder to categorize. Religious themes mixed with atomic physics, crucifixions where Christ hung in front of geometric shapes representing nuclear particles. Madonnas with DNA helixes in the background. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some thought he was mocking religion. Others thought he'd found God. The truth was somewhere in between. Dali had always been interested in whatever was forbidden or mysterious. In Catholic Spain under Franco, religion was mandatory and therefore boring. But the intersection of faith and science, that was unstable ground. That was interesting. The Madonna of Port Ligat was finished in 1950. It shows Mary holding the infant Christ, but both of their bodies are fragmented, broken into geometric pieces that float in space without touching. They're together and separate at the same time, whole but divided. The Vatican gave it a private blessing. Dali was thrilled. He'd spent his entire career offending people, and now the Pope approved of his work. He took this as permission to go further. Christ of St. John of the Cross came next, a crucifixion painted from above, looking down at Christ on the cross. No blood, no nails, no suffering. just a body suspended in space, above a landscape that might be Port Ligat or might be nowhere. It's one of his most famous paintings. People line up to see it in Glasgow, where it hangs now. They stand in front of it in silence. Some cry. It does something that very few of Dali's paintings do. It makes you feel something beyond admiration for technique. Whether Dali felt it while painting is another question. He told an interviewer that the composition came to him in a dream. This was almost certainly a lie. The painting is too carefully constructed, too mathematically precise. Dreams don't work like that. But the lie was part of the performance. Dali, the mad genius channeling visions from the unconscious. People wanted to believe it, so he gave them the story they wanted. Whether it was true didn't matter. The painting existed. That was enough. Back in Port Ligat, the house was taking shape. Dali filled it with taxidermied animals, religious icons, optical illusions. Every surface was covered with something strange. Visitors who came expecting a normal home were confronted with chaos that somehow made perfect sense. Gala hated it. She wanted elegance, sophistication, a place where she could entertain wealthy collectors and feel like the aristocrat she'd always pretended to be. Instead, she got a madhouse designed by a man who'd never grown up. They started spending more time apart. Gala would go to Paris or New York for months at a time. Dali stayed in Port Ligat and painted. When she returned, they'd fight about money, about her lovers, about his refusal to act like a normal person. These fights had always happened, but now they had an edge of exhaustion. They'd been together for over 20 years. They'd saved each other's lives multiple times, and they were tired. Not of each other exactly. Tired of the weight of being Salvador and Gala Dali, of maintaining the mythology they'd built. But leaving wasn't an option. They needed each other too much. Gala managed everything. The money, the contracts, the gallery relationships. Without her, Dali would have been helpless. And Gala's identity was completely tied to being Dali's wife. She was nobody without him, so they stayed together and made each other miserable in the way that only people who know each other completely can. The house became their shared project, the thing they could both agree on. If they couldn't fix their relationship, at least they could build something permanent. Something shifted in Dali during the 1950s. The man who'd spent decades attacking religion, mocking tradition, declaring himself a revolutionary, now started painting Madonnas, sacred hearts, biblical scenes rendered with the same technical precision he'd once reserved for melting clocks and burning giraffes. Critics called it a betrayal. Fellow surrealists accused him of selling out. André Breton, who'd expelled Dali from the movement years earlier, said this proved what he'd always suspected. Dali had no principles, no genuine beliefs. He was a mercenary who'd paint anything if someone paid him enough. They weren't entirely wrong. Dali did accept commissions. He did paint what wealthy patrons wanted. An American collector would ask for a religious scene, and Dali would deliver something spectacular. Technically perfect, emotionally calculated. But calling it pure cynicism misses something important. Dali had always been obsessed with Catholicism. He'd rejected it violently in his youth, turned it into nightmares on canvas, used its imagery to shock and disturb. But he'd never stopped thinking about it. The rituals, the symbols, the architecture of belief that had shaped his childhood in Figueres. His father had been an atheist, aggressively so. He'd raised his sons to think religion was superstition for weak minds. But Dali's mother had taken him to church, dressed him in white for communion, taught him to pray. When she died, those memories became sacred in a way nothing else did. Not because he believed in God. Dali's theology was always flexible, but because they connected him to her, the only person who'd loved him without conditions or complications. So the religious paintings weren't just about money, they were excavations, attempts to recover something he'd spent his entire adult life running from. The problem was that Dali couldn't paint anything sincerely anymore. Everything he touched became performance. Even his most personal work looked like it was designed for maximum effect. He couldn't help himself. The need to impress, to shock, to be seen, had calcified into his technique. You can see it in The Sacrament of the Last Supper from 1955. Christ and the apostles gathered around a table inside a transparent dodecahedron. The perspective is impossible. The space doesn't make sense geometrically, but it looks profound. It looks like revelation. Museums bought it immediately. People stood in front of it and felt moved. Was Dali moved while painting it? Probably not. He was too busy calculating angles, making sure the composition would photograph well, thinking about how it would look in galleries. The spiritual content was secondary to the visual impact. This was the trap he'd built for himself. He'd become so good at manufacturing significance that genuine feeling couldn't break through anymore. Everything was technique, everything was surface. The paintings worked, but they didn't breathe. Port Ligat became his laboratory. He'd wake up early, before Gala stirred, and work in silence. The house faced east. Morning light came through the windows and turned the bay silver. Dali would stand at his easel and paint the same landscape he'd been painting for 20 years. The rocks, the water, the fishing boats that moved across the bay at dawn. He knew every detail by memory, could paint it blind if necessary. This repetition was comforting. The world outside Port Ligat kept changing. Art movements came and went. Surrealism had given way to abstract expressionism. Jackson Pollock was throwing paint at canvases. Critics were declaring that representational painting was dead, that Dali's technical skill was old-fashioned, that the future belonged to pure abstraction. Dali hated this, hated that people celebrated Pollock's chaos, hated that his own precision was dismissed as conservative. He'd say things in interviews, cruel things about abstract painters, called them frauds, said a chimpanzee could do what they did. These attacks made him sound defensive, petty, like an old man yelling at clouds, which in a way he was. He'd built his career on being shocking, and now younger artists were shocking people more effectively. His tricks didn't work anymore. The melting clocks had been revolutionary in 1931. By 1955, they were his brand, his signature. People expected them. A Dali painting without something melting or floating felt incomplete, so he gave them what they wanted: more clocks, more crucifixions, more double images and optical illusions. Each painting technically flawless, each one completely hollow. He knew it. Gala knew it. But admitting it would have meant acknowledging that his best work was behind him, that he'd already painted everything he had to say and was now just repeating himself, with minor variations. This was unbearable, so he pretended otherwise, talked about his new work as though each painting was another breakthrough, another revolution. The critics didn't believe him. They'd stopped taking him seriously years ago, but the public still came, still bought tickets to see his exhibitions, still wanted to meet the man with the moustache who claimed to be a genius. And Dali needed the attention, needed the validation. More than ever now that his actual creative powers were fading. The performances got bigger, more elaborate. He'd appear at openings wearing bizarre costumes, would make pronouncements about art and politics that contradicted themselves within the same sentence, would sign autographs for hours, drawing little sketches for fans who'd waited in line. These sketches were worthless, quick doodles that took 30 seconds, but people treasured them, took them home and framed them, had proof they'd met Salvador Dali. Meanwhile, Gala was conducting her own performances. She'd discovered that being Dali's wife gave her access to wealthy men who wanted proximity to genius, men who'd pay enormous sums for her attention, for the fantasy that they were special, that Gala had chosen them out of everyone she could have. She was in her 60s now, still beautiful in the right light, still capable of making men believe whatever she wanted them to believe. But the effort was showing. The performances required more makeup, more careful staging, more willingness to ignore what was happening to her body. She started collecting younger lovers, men in their 20s who treated her like an older woman playing at being young. They were kind about it, took her money, listened to her stories about the old days in Paris, pretended to be impressed. Dali knew about all of it, knew and said nothing. He had no moral standing, no right to complain. Their marriage had never been exclusive, had never been about fidelity. It was about survival, about two people who'd built something together and couldn't let it fall apart without destroying themselves. So they maintained the facade, appeared together at events, held hands for photographers, gave interviews about their eternal love. The house kept growing. New rooms, new wings. Dali would decide he needed a library, and workers would arrive to build it. Then a studio with north-facing windows. Then a tower where he could see the entire bay. The construction never stopped. It was compulsive, as though Dali believed that if he kept building, kept expanding, he could somehow prevent time from moving forward, freeze everything in place. The past was already gone. His mother dead for decades, his father dead. Federico Garcia Lorca executed in a ditch in 1936. Buñuel in Mexico, making films Dali would never see. Everyone from his youth, either dead or unreachable. The house was all he had left. The only thing that connected him to the boy he'd been before fame and madness and Gala. He painted it obsessively. Hundreds of paintings featuring the same view, the same rocks, the same fishing boats. Critics said he was repeating himself. They were right, but repetition was the point. Dali was trying to make something permanent, to pin down a moment that kept slipping away. It didn't work. It never works. But he kept trying anyway. The paintings got larger, more technically ambitious. He'd spend months on a single canvas, layering paint, adjusting details, making sure every reflection in the water was perfect. Then he'd sell it to an American collector for an obscene amount of money, and the painting would disappear into a private collection. Gone forever. This bothered him more than he admitted. He wanted his work in museums, wanted it preserved, wanted future generations to see what he'd accomplished. But the best paintings kept vanishing into private hands, locked away in vaults and penthouses where nobody could see them. He'd created his own trap, made himself so commercially successful that his work became a commodity, an investment. People bought Dali paintings the way they bought gold, not to look at them but to own them, to have something rare and valuable. Gala encouraged this, pushed prices higher, negotiated harder. The more money they made, the more secure she felt. She'd grown up poor, had spent her early years in Russia watching her family's modest wealth evaporate, had married Paul Éluard partially because he had money, had left him for Dali partially because Dali had more. Money wasn't just money to her, it was safety, proof that she wouldn't end up back where she'd started. So she squeezed every transaction, made collectors compete, drove prices up until people complained that Dali was overpriced. She didn't care. Let them complain. They'd still pay. The 1960s arrived and everything Dali had built felt suddenly old. The world was changing faster than he could process. Young people were rejecting everything his generation had believed. Rejecting authority, rejecting tradition, rejecting the idea that technical skill mattered. They wanted authenticity, rawness, art that felt immediate and alive. Dali's paintings, with their mathematical precision and classical technique, felt like artifacts from another era. Museum pieces. He tried to adapt, started experimenting with new subjects, pop culture, space exploration, nuclear physics. He painted Marilyn Monroe, painted astronauts, painted atoms splitting apart in clouds of colour. The paintings were accomplished, technically brilliant, completely empty. He knew it but couldn't stop, couldn't admit that he'd become what he'd always feared, a relic, an old master whose time had passed. So he worked harder, painted more, appeared at more events, gave more interviews, said increasingly bizarre things to stay relevant, claimed he was a mystic, claimed he could see the future, claimed his paintings contained secret codes that only the enlightened could decipher. Some people believed him. Most didn't, but everyone kept watching, kept paying attention, which was all he really wanted. Port Ligat became a refuge, the only place where he didn't have to perform, where he could sit in silence and watch the water and not think about whether anyone was looking. Gala hated the silence, needed noise, company, proof that she still existed. She'd leave for weeks at a time, go to Paris or New York or wherever her current lover was waiting. Dali would stay behind and paint. The house felt different without her, emptier but also calmer. He could work without interruptions, without her voice cutting through his concentration, without her demands. But he'd never learned to take care of himself, couldn't cook, barely ate when she was gone, would work for 12 hours straight and forget that his body needed food. A housekeeper would come and find him passed out at his easel. She'd make him eat something, put him to bed. He'd wake up the next morning and start again. This was the pattern: work until exhaustion, sleep, wake, repeat. The paintings piled up, dozens of them, some finished, some abandoned halfway, some that he'd return to months later and rework until they bore no resemblance to what they'd been. He was 60 years old. Gala was 66. They'd been together for over 30 years, had survived poverty, war, exile, fame, scandal, had built an empire together, made themselves into legends. And they were both exhausted. Not done exactly, too stubborn to quit, but running on fumes, going through motions that had once felt vital and now just felt necessary. The house kept growing, the paintings kept coming, the performances continued, but something essential had worn away. The spark that had made it all worthwhile. They were trapped in the mythology they'd created, unable to stop, unable to change, unable to admit that maybe they'd already done everything they were going to do. The 1970s arrived with brutal clarity. Dali was now in his 60s, watching the world speed past him while he stood still, clutching at relevance like a drowning man clutches at driftwood. The new generation of artists didn't just ignore him, they mocked him, called him a sellout, a clown, a man who'd traded his genius for money and fame. They had a point. He'd spent decades carefully constructing the Dali brand, turning himself into a commodity, and now that commodity was dated, old, like bell-bottoms or disco balls, something people recognised but no longer took seriously. He tried to fight back, published statements defending himself, gave interviews where he claimed the young artists were jealous, didn't understand true craftsmanship, didn't have the technical skills to create real art, but his protests sounded defensive, desperate, like an aging boxer insisting he could still take a punch. The truth was simpler and more painful. The art world had moved on. Abstract expressionism had given way to pop art, which was giving way to conceptual art. People were making art out of anything now. Soup cans, comic strips, their own bodies. The idea mattered more than the execution. Anyone could be an artist if they had the right concept. Dali's painstaking technique, his classical training, his mathematical precision. None of it mattered anymore. In fact, it worked against him. Made him seem fussy, old-fashioned, a relic from an era when people still believed in beauty and skill. So he adapted the only way he knew how, by going bigger, louder, more outrageous. If people wouldn't take his art seriously, he'd give them spectacle, become so famous, so impossible to ignore, that they'd have no choice but to pay attention. He appeared on American television, game shows, talk shows, anywhere that would have him. Would show up with his waxed moustache and his cape, and his walking stick topped with a golden skull. Would speak in broken English about his genius, about his visions, about the mystical properties of his paintings. The audiences loved it, laughed with him or at him, he didn't care which. He was on screen. That's what mattered. He collaborated with Disney, designed album covers for rock bands, created advertisements for chocolate and perfume and anything else that would pay. His friends from the old days, the ones still alive, were horrified. Breton had been right all along, they said. Dali had sold out completely, become a caricature of himself. But Dali didn't care about their judgment anymore, or claimed not to. He'd spent his entire life seeking approval from people who'd never truly accepted him. The surrealists, the critics, the art establishment, all of them had eventually turned on him. So why should he care what they thought now? Money was simpler, more honest. People gave you money because they wanted what you were selling. No hidden agendas, no political games, just transaction. He could understand that. Gala encouraged it, pushed him toward every commercial opportunity. She'd become his manager in all but name, negotiated his fees, scheduled his appearances, made sure every painting sold for the maximum price. She was ruthless about it, would walk away from deals if she didn't get what she wanted, knew that Dali's fame meant they could demand almost anything. The money poured in. Millions, more than they could possibly spend. But Gala wanted more, always more. She'd come from nothing, remembered what poverty felt like, and was determined never to experience it again. So she squeezed every opportunity, pushed Dali to produce more paintings, attend more events, sign more contracts. He complied. What else could he do? She'd been managing his life for decades. He didn't know how to function without her. Didn't know how to negotiate a contract or balance a checkbook or make a doctor's appointment. She'd taken care of all of it while he painted. Now he was dependent on her in ways that went beyond love or partnership. She was necessary, like oxygen, but she was also dying. Not quickly, not obviously, but aging in ways that terrified her. Her skin was loosening, her hair thinning, her body betraying her with every passing year. She looked in the mirror and saw what she'd spent her whole life running from. Ordinary, invisible, old. So she fought it, spent fortunes on beauty treatments, creams and injections and procedures, wore heavy makeup and elaborate wigs, dressed in styles meant for women half her age. It didn't work. Just made her look desperate, but she couldn't stop trying. And she took lovers, younger men, much younger, men in their 20s who wanted access to her world, her money, her connections. She didn't care about their motivations, needed them to prove she was still desirable, still powerful, still Gala. Dali knew. Couldn't not know. She barely hid it anymore, would disappear for days with her current favourite, come back smelling of cologne and cigarettes and other men. He said nothing. What could he say? She'd been his muse, his manager, his mother, his tormentor for 40 years. He couldn't imagine life without her, didn't want to. So he painted, buried himself in work, created pieces that grew increasingly strange and desperate, religious imagery mixed with science fiction, Christ floating above nuclear explosions, Madonnas rendered in mathematical spirals, paintings that tried to reconcile faith and reason, mysticism and technology, the eternal and the contemporary. They were technically brilliant. His hand was still steady, his eye still sharp. But something was missing. The paintings felt calculated, manufactured, like he was going through the motions of being Dali without actually being him. Critics noticed, wrote reviews that were polite but unenthusiastic, acknowledged his skill while questioning his vision, suggested, delicately, that perhaps his best work was behind him, that he was coasting on reputation. He read every review, obsessed over every word, couldn't help himself, still needed their approval, even though he claimed not to, still measured his worth by what they wrote. Port Legat was his only refuge. The house had grown enormous over the years, room after room added in no particular pattern, a labyrinth of spaces connected by narrow passages and unexpected stairs. Visitors got lost trying to find the bathroom. Dali liked it that way. The house reflected his mind. Complicated, irrational, full of hidden corners. He'd installed a giant stuffed polar bear in the entrance hall, a Cadillac in the courtyard with a fountain that poured water over the hood, eggs balanced on the roof, strange sculptures scattered throughout the gardens. The house was as much a performance as his paintings, another piece of the Dali mythology. But late at night, when the visitors were gone and Gala was off with her lovers, he'd sit alone in his studio and feel the weight of it all. The performance, the myth, the constant need to be Dali. He was exhausted, had been playing this role for so long he couldn't remember who he'd been before. Wasn't sure there'd been anyone there at all. Sometimes he'd stand in front of old photographs, look at his younger self. That thin, intense young man with the wild eyes and the conviction that he was going to change art forever. He barely recognized him. That person had believed in something, had been driven by vision, not commerce, had cared about the work itself, not just what it could buy. When had that changed? He couldn't pinpoint the moment. It had happened gradually, one compromise after another, one commercial project, one publicity stunt, each one justified as necessary, strategic, until the compromises had become his life, and he couldn't remember what he'd been compromising for. Gala returned from one of her trips looking different, thinner, paler. She claimed she was fine, just tired, but Dali could see it. Something was wrong. Her energy was off, her voice weaker. She moved through the house like a ghost of herself. He didn't ask, didn't want to know. If he didn't acknowledge it, maybe it wasn't real. Maybe she'd recover on her own, bounce back like she always did. But she didn't. She got worse, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then more obviously. She'd forget things, lose track of conversations mid-sentence, fall asleep in her chair in the middle of the day. Doctors were called, tests were run, the results were kept from Dali. Gala insisted, didn't want him to worry, didn't want him to see her as weak. But he knew anyway, could read it in the doctors' faces, in the way they spoke to her with careful gentleness. She was 77 years old, he was 71. They'd been together for 43 years. Nearly half a century of their lives, intertwined so completely they couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He tried to paint, sat at his easel for hours, but his hand wouldn't move. The brush felt foreign in his fingers, like he'd forgotten how to use it. Without Gala to push him, to schedule his days, to tell him what to do next, he was lost. Didn't know how to function. Would wake up and wander through the house not sure what he was supposed to be doing. The staff would find him standing in random rooms, staring at nothing. She rallied briefly, had a few weeks where she seemed better, more alert, more herself. She used that time to organise, to make lists, to prepare for what was coming even if she wouldn't say it out loud. She hired more staff, gave them instructions about Dali's care, how to make his meals, when to remind him to bathe, what medications he needed. She was setting up a system that could function without her. Dali watched her do this and felt something break inside him. She was leaving, preparing to abandon him, and he was powerless to stop it. He wanted to beg her to stay, to fight harder, to not give up, but the words wouldn't come. He'd spent his entire adult life unable to express genuine emotion, had built walls so high around his feelings that now, when he needed to break through them, he couldn't find the way. So he sat with her, held her hand. That was all he could manage, all he knew how to give. She'd squeeze his fingers, whisper something he couldn't quite hear, then drift off to sleep while he watched. The house felt different, quieter, like it was holding its breath, waiting. Staff moved through the rooms on soft feet, spoke in hushed voices. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone except Dali, who refused to believe it, couldn't let himself believe it. He'd survived everything. The Spanish Civil War, World War II, poverty, exile, success, scandal. Every crisis had been temporary. Every problem had been solved. This would be too. It had to be. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he'd stand at the window and look out at the Mediterranean. The same water he'd been staring at for decades, unchanging, eternal, indifferent to human suffering, and he'd remember being young. Remember the first time Gala had looked at him and seen something worth saving. Remember how she'd taken his chaos and given it structure, taken his vision and made it real. Without her, he was nothing. Just another failed artist from a small town who dreamed too big. She died on June 10th, 1982. Dali wasn't there. They'd moved her to the hospital in Barcelona. He'd stayed at Pubal. Too weak to travel, they said. Too fragile. But really, he just couldn't face it. Couldn't watch her slip away. So he stayed in their castle and waited for the phone to ring. When it did, he already knew. Could feel it in his bones. The moment the line between them finally severed after 43 years of being connected. He didn't cry, didn't scream, just stood there holding the phone, listening to someone explain that she was gone. Then he hung up and walked to his studio, sat in front of a blank canvas, picked up a brush, set it back down. What was the point? Who was he painting for? His instructions were clear. She'd made them months ago, wanted to be buried at Pubal, in the castle, their castle, the place she'd made her own. He agreed, of course he agreed. Whatever she wanted. The funeral was small, private. He didn't attend, couldn't. They told him he was too unwell, that the journey would be too much. He accepted this excuse gratefully. Better to remember her alive than to see her body lowered into the ground. They buried her in the crypt beneath the castle's main hall, a room she'd chosen herself, had it prepared, decorated, made beautiful even in death. That was Gala, controlling everything right to the end. After the funeral, people expected him to return to Figueres, to the museum, to the life he'd built there, but he refused, insisted on staying at Pubal, in the castle that still smelled like her perfume, still had her clothes in the closets, still felt like she might walk through the door at any moment. The staff worried, tried to convince him to leave. This place isn't good for you, they said. Too many memories, too much grief. But where else would he go? Back to Port Ligat. That house was even worse. Every room there reminded him of their early years together, when they were young and broke and building something from nothing. No, Pubal was right. She was here, buried beneath his feet. If he left, he'd be abandoning her, and he'd promised himself he'd never do that again. His health deteriorated rapidly. The Parkinson's symptoms that had been manageable became severe. His hands shook constantly. Could barely hold a spoon to eat. Couldn't dress himself. Needed help with everything. Depression settled over him like a heavy blanket. Wouldn't get out of bed some days. Would just lie there staring at the ceiling, thinking about nothing and everything simultaneously. His mind, once so sharp and quick, started to blur at the edges. Thoughts became confused. Time became elastic. He'd forget what year it was. Would call for Gala and be genuinely surprised when she didn't appear. The castle staff did their best, fed him, bathed him, tried to keep him comfortable. But they weren't nurses, weren't equipped to handle someone this ill. They called his daughter Cecilia, told her he needed proper care. She came immediately. Hadn't seen him in years. The sight of him shocked her. This wasn't the vital, energetic man she remembered. This was a frail old person, broken, lost. She tried to connect with him, to bridge the decades of distance between them, but he barely recognized her, would stare at her face like he was trying to remember who she was. It hurt, watching her father disappear in front of her eyes, but she stayed. Made arrangements, hired proper medical staff, tried to make his final days as comfortable as possible. He painted one last picture in late summer of 1982, just a few months after Gala died. It was called The Swallow's Tale, based on catastrophe theory, a mathematical concept about sudden changes in systems. How things can appear stable right up until they collapse completely. Fitting. His hand shook so badly he could barely hold the brush. The painting is rough, unfinished looking, nothing like his earlier precision, but it's powerful in its rawness. You can see the struggle in every brushstroke, the effort it took just to drag paint across canvas. When it was done, he set down his brush and never picked one up again. Couldn't see the point anymore. Art had been his way of communicating with the world, his method of making sense of the chaos inside his head. But now the chaos had won. Swallowed him whole. He stopped eating properly, would take a few bites and push the plate away. Lost weight rapidly. His clothes hung off his frame, like he was a child playing dress-up in adult garments. Developed bedsores, infections. His body was shutting down, piece by piece. In August, a fire started in his bedroom. No one knows exactly how. Maybe a cigarette he'd fallen asleep with. Maybe faulty wiring. The flames spread quickly, consumed the bed, the curtains, part of the wall. Staff heard the smoke alarm and rushed in. Found him lying in bed, flames climbing the walls around him. They dragged him out, got him to safety. He'd suffered burns on his legs and lower body. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough, painful enough. The doctors said he needed to be hospitalized, proper burn treatment, round-the-clock monitoring. But moving him from Poo Bowl felt like a betrayal. He'd wanted to stay with Gala, near her, in the place they'd shared. They took him anyway, had no choice, transferred him to a clinic in Barcelona. He hated it immediately. The sterile white walls, the antiseptic smell, the constant noise of other patients. This wasn't where he belonged. He'd spent his life in beautiful places, surrounded by his own creations, by luxury and excess and carefully curated chaos. This was institutional, impersonal, wrong. He demanded to leave, became agitated, difficult. The staff had to sedate him to keep him calm, keep him from pulling out his IVs and trying to walk out on legs that couldn't support his weight anymore. His friends came to visit, the few who were left. Most of the people he'd known were dead now. Buñuel, Lorca executed in the Civil War decades ago. Éluard, even Breton, his old enemy, gone. He was outliving everyone, becoming a relic of an era that had ended without him noticing. Robert Deschamps came frequently, sat by his bed and talked, showed him photographs of his paintings, tried to remind him who he'd been, what he'd accomplished, but Dali would just stare at the images like he was looking at someone else's work. Couldn't connect the vibrant paintings to his current reality. The distance was too vast. Amanda Lear visited once. She'd been his muse in the 1960s and 70s. Young and beautiful, and full of life. He'd painted her, photographed her, used her image in dozens of works. She walked into his hospital room and barely recognized him. The man in the bed looked ancient, shriveled, nothing like the charismatic artist who'd mentored her. They talked for a few minutes. He seemed to know who she was, called her by name, but his attention drifted. He kept looking past her at the wall, like he was seeing something she couldn't. When she left, she cried in the hallway, couldn't hold it together anymore. The man she'd known was already gone. His body just hadn't figured it out yet. December came, then 1983. He was still alive somehow, still breathing, but barely. The doctors were amazed. By all accounts, he should have died months ago, but his heart kept beating. His lungs kept pulling in air, like his body was too stubborn to quit, even though his mind had already checked out. King Juan Carlos of Spain came to visit, brought photographers, wanted to be seen paying respects to Spain's greatest living artist. The whole thing was staged, choreographed for maximum political impact. Dali had been declared a national treasure years earlier. His museum in Figueres was a tourist attraction that brought money into Catalonia. The government had a vested interest in his legacy. The king sat by his bed, held his hand, said kind words that Dali probably didn't comprehend. The cameras flashed. The moment was captured. Tomorrow's newspapers would show the king honouring the dying artist. Perfect optics. After the king left, Dali was alone again. Just him and the nurses, the doctors, the machines monitoring his vital signs. He'd spent his entire life performing, being Salvador Dali, playing the role of genius madman for audiences around the world. Now there was no one left to perform for, no reason to maintain the facade. He could finally be himself, whoever that was. Problem was, he'd been performing for so long, he didn't know how to stop. Didn't know who he was without the moustache and the cane and the outrageous pronouncements. Strip away the costume and what remained? And just a scared old man who'd lost the only person who truly understood him. In early 1984, they moved him back to Figueres, to the Torre Galatea, the tower attached to his museum. He'd had apartments built there years ago, lived above his own legacy, surrounded by tourists who came to see his work. It was the closest thing to home he had left. Port Ligat was too remote, Pubol too painful, but Figueres was his birthplace, the town where everything had started. Maybe it was fitting to end here too. The apartments were comfortable, spacious, decorated with his furniture, his paintings, his objects. The staff set up a hospital bed in the main room, medical equipment, everything he needed. He could hear the tourists downstairs sometimes, walking through the museum, exclaiming over the paintings, taking photographs, living proof that his work would outlive him, that he'd succeeded in becoming immortal even if his body was failing. He watched television. The staff would turn it on, and he'd stare at the screen, not really following the programs but comforted by the noise, the movement, the proof that the world was still turning outside his room. Sometimes they'd show news about art, about exhibitions, about his own work selling for record prices at auction. His paintings were worth millions now, tens of millions, more money than he'd ever seen even at the height of his career. But what good was it? Couldn't buy him more time, couldn't bring Gala back, couldn't reverse the Parkinson's or heal the burns or restore his mind. Money was just paper, numbers in accounts he'd never access. His daughter came regularly. Cecilia had moved past the hurt, past the decades of neglect. She was here now, present, trying to give him comfort in his final days. She'd sit and read to him, hold his hand, tell him stories about her life, her children, his grandchildren he'd never met. He'd listen, or seem to. Hard to tell how much he actually understood, but she kept talking anyway, filling the silence, making sure he wasn't alone. The doctors said it could be any day now. His body was failing in multiple ways simultaneously. Heart, kidneys, lungs, everything shutting down. They made him comfortable. That's all they could do. Morphine for the pain, oxygen to help him breathe, and time, just waiting for time to run out. He'd lived 80 years, 8 decades of creating and destroying and reinventing himself, of pushing boundaries and breaking rules and refusing to be anything other than exactly what he wanted to be. Not many people could say that. Not many had the courage or the madness or the sheer force of will to live life entirely on their own terms. But he had. For better and worse, he'd been Salvador Dali. And now, Salvador Dali was dying. January 23rd, 1989. The day started like any other. Nurses checking vitals, staff bringing breakfast he wouldn't eat, the television murmuring in the background. But something was different. Everyone could feel it. The way his breathing had changed. Shallower, more laboured. The way he seemed to be receding, pulling inward, away from the world. Cecilia was there. She'd been staying close these past few weeks, sleeping in a nearby room, ready for whenever it happened. She sat beside him, held his hand, talked quietly, about nothing important, just filling the air with sound, with presence, making sure he knew someone was there. The doctors came and went, checked monitors, adjusted medications. There wasn't much to do except wait. His heart was giving out, slowly but inevitably. Could be hours, could be days, but not long. He opened his eyes once, around noon, looked at Cecilia, really looked, like he was seeing her for the first time. Or maybe the last. She couldn't tell if he recognized her, if he knew who she was, but something passed between them. Some moment of connection, then his eyes closed again. The afternoon stretched long. Nurses changed shifts. New faces, same routine. The light outside faded, winter sunset coming early, casting long shadows through the windows, and at 5:25 in the evening, his breathing stopped. Just stopped. No dramatic final gasp, no struggle. He simply ceased. The monitors confirmed what everyone already knew. Salvador Dali was dead, 84 years old. The staff moved efficiently. They'd done this before, knew the protocol. Cecilia sat for a while longer, still holding his hand. Now cold. She'd lost both parents in less than 5 years. First Gala, now him. The two people who'd defined his entire existence, gone. The news spread quickly. By evening it was on every channel. Front page of every newspaper by morning. Salvador Dali, the last of the great surrealists, dead. The obituaries were massive, page after page, analysing his life, his work, his legacy. Some praised him as a genius, a visionary who'd expanded the possibilities of art. Others dismissed him as a showman, a talented painter who'd wasted his gifts on spectacle and self-promotion. Both were right, both were wrong. He'd been too complicated for simple judgments. The funeral was a spectacle. Of course it was. He'd planned it, years ago. Specific instructions. He wanted to be embalmed, displayed, buried in his museum, under the stage in the main hall, where visitors would walk over him forever. The Spanish authorities balked initially. Burial in a museum wasn't standard procedure, but they made an exception. For Dali, always exceptions for Dali. The lying in state was public. Thousands came, filed past the coffin, dressed in his signature moustache. The facial hair they'd maintained even in death, stiff and waxed, pointing upward. One last defiant gesture. Some mourners cried, others took photographs. A few laughed. He would have approved. The funeral itself was smaller. Family, close friends, officials. The casket was lowered into a crypt beneath the museum stage, right in the centre, the heart of his greatest creation. Now, his tomb. No religious ceremony. He'd drifted from the church decades ago, despite the Catholic imagery that filled his work. The symbols were aesthetic, not devotional. Tools for creating meaning, not expressing faith. They sealed the crypt, laid a simple marker. His name. Dates, nothing else. The tourists returned the next day, walking over his grave without knowing. Just another part of the museum. Another layer of the legend. The will was complicated, as expected. He'd left everything to Spain. The entire estate, paintings, drawings, sculptures, furniture, real estate, all of it, property of the Spanish state. It was a final middle finger to everyone who'd tried to control him. Family couldn't fight over it. Dealers couldn't exploit it. The work would be preserved, public, available. That's what he wanted. But there were complications, questions about authenticity. He'd signed thousands of blank sheets in his later years. Let dealers fill them in, print reproductions, sell them as originals. The market was flooded with questionable Dalis, some real, some fake, most somewhere in between. It would take decades to sort out. Experts still argue about certain pieces, whether they're authentic, whether they matter, whether Dali himself would have cared. Probably not. He'd stopped caring about authenticity years ago. Once you've declared yourself a genius, once you've convinced the world you're a living legend, the line between real and fake becomes meaningless. Everything you touch becomes real by association. The museums held retrospectives, major exhibitions, tracing his career from the student works through the surrealist masterpieces to the late-period religious paintings. Critics reassessed. Some who'd dismissed him reconsidered, saw depth they'd missed, technical skill obscured by the publicity stunts. Others doubled down, called him a fraud, a huckster who'd fooled the art world. The debates continue. They'll probably never stop. That's part of his legacy too. The controversy, the uncertainty, the refusal to fit into neat categories. But the work remains. The persistence of memory. The elephants, the melting clocks, the crucifixions, the Madonnas, hundreds of paintings, thousands of drawings, sculptures, films, photographs, books, a massive body of work, uneven in quality. Some pieces brilliant, others merely competent, but always distinctive, always unmistakably Dali. The museum in Figueres thrived, became one of the most visited sites in Spain. Tourists came from everywhere to see the building he'd designed, the works he'd selected, to walk over his grave. The Torre Galatea still stands, the apartments where he died. They're part of the museum now, preserved. You can see where he lived, where he worked, where he finally stopped. Port Ligat became a museum too, the house where he and Gala had spent their happiest years. Tourists can walk through the rooms, see the strange architecture, the egg decorations, the taxidermy animals, the massive mirrors. It's frozen in time, a snapshot of their life before everything fell apart. Pubol Castle is also open, Gala's palace, where she lived separately, where she died, where Dali nearly burned to death. The rooms are exactly as they left them. Her bedroom, his studio, the gardens, the crypt where she's buried. People visit all three sites, the Dali Triangle, a pilgrimage through his life, from the beginning in Figueres to the middle years at Port Ligat to the end at Pubol. Each place tells part of the story, but none tells it all, because the story was never coherent, never linear. It was surreal, fragmented, contradictory, just like his art. His influence spread in unexpected ways. Pop culture absorbed him. The moustache became iconic, shorthand for artistic genius, for eccentricity, for creative freedom. He appeared in commercials, cartoons, music videos, always the same image, the wild eyes, the cane, the moustache, a caricature that somehow captured something essential. Artists studied him, some to learn his technique, the precision, the craftsmanship, the way he could make impossible things look real, others to understand his career, how he'd built a brand, created a persona, turned himself into a commodity. Both approaches were valid. He'd mastered both the art and the business, the craft and the con. The museums kept finding new works, pieces that hadn't been catalogued, drawings in private collections, paintings in storage. Each discovery sparked debates, authentication battles, lawsuits. His estate fought constantly, defending the legacy, protecting the market, ensuring that only verified works carried his name. But the fakes kept appearing, always more fakes, some obvious, others sophisticated enough to fool experts. The Dali market became a minefield. Collectors paid millions for pieces that might be forgeries. The uncertainty added to the legend, made him even more mysterious, even more surreal, appropriate somehow, that even his legacy would be impossible to pin down. The critical consensus shifted over time. Early assessments focused on the surrealist period, the 1920s and 30s, the work that broke new ground, challenged perception, revolutionized art. Later scholars looked at the whole career, the religious paintings, the late portraits, the commercial work, found value there too. Different value maybe, but value. They stopped judging him by surrealist standards, started evaluating him on his own terms, as an artist who refused to stay in one box, who kept reinventing, kept pushing, kept creating until he physically couldn't anymore. The comparison to Picasso continued, still continues. The two Spanish giants of 20th century art. Picasso died in 73, 16 years before Dali, long enough for the art world to process his legacy, to understand his place. Dali's legacy was messier, more contested. Picasso had been serious, revolutionary, transformative, Dali had been theatrical, commercial, difficult to categorize, but both had changed art forever. Both had lived exactly as they wanted. Both had become legends. Maybe that's all that matters. Not the critical consensus, not the market value, not the academic debates, just the work. The images that persist, the ideas that spread, the influence that continues. The melting clocks still melt. The elephants still walk on spider legs. The tigers still leap from pomegranates. The dreams still disturb. The unconscious still surfaces. The boundaries still blur. That's the legacy, not the man, not the persona, not the publicity stunts or the scandals or the controversies. The images, the things he made, the visions he pulled from somewhere deep and strange and put on canvas where everyone could see them. He'd wanted immortality. He got it, not through his personality. That died with him. Not through his fame. That's already fading. The younger generation barely knows his name. But through the work. The paintings that hang in museums. The images that appear in textbooks. The ideas that infected art and never left. He'd succeeded. On his own terms, in his own way. Salvador Dali, born 1804, died 1989, buried under his museum, walked over by tourists, exactly as he planned. But the story doesn't end with his death. Can't end there, because the real complications, the real battles, the real revelations, those were just beginning. The museum opened 3 years after his death, January of '92. The Teatro Museo Dali. His final masterpiece, the building he'd spent years designing, every detail controlled, every element symbolic, every room a stage. Visitors walked through his mind-made architecture, saw his obsessions rendered in 3 dimensions. The geodesic dome, the giant eggs, the Mae West room where furniture arranged just right became a face, optical illusions everywhere. Nothing was what it seemed. The collection inside was massive. Paintings from every period, sculptures, drawings, jewellery designs, commercial work, everything. Curated by the artist himself before he died, arranged exactly how he wanted. This was his statement, his final word, not a retrospective someone else assembled, his own vision of his legacy. And in the crypt below, his body. Tourists walked over his grave without knowing. He'd planned that too, wanted to be part of the experience, wanted visitors literally standing on him while they viewed his art. Morbid maybe, but perfectly Dali. The attendance exceeded expectations. Hundreds of thousands came that first year. Millions since. Second most visited museum in Spain after the Prado. People travelled from everywhere, stood in lines, paid admission, walked through rooms that bent reality, took photos, bought postcards, merch. The gift shop sold everything. Prints, posters, t-shirts, coffee mugs. Dali had become a brand, his moustache an icon, his name synonymous with surrealism, exactly what he wanted. But the legal battles intensified. His estate was chaos, Gala's daughter, Dali's secretary, various foundations, everyone claiming rights, fighting over control. The authentication committee became a battleground. Who decided what was real? What criteria counted? How much documentation was enough? The market demanded answers. Collectors needed certainty, but certainty was impossible. Dali had signed blank papers, thousands of them, given them away, sold them, left them lying around. Anyone could print anything on those papers, add a signature, claim authenticity. The fakes multiplied, sophisticated operations, criminal networks, entire galleries built on forgeries. Some experts estimated that 80% of Dali prints in circulation were fake, maybe more. The real number was unknowable. His secretary, Enrique Sabater, became a central figure. He'd been there during the final years, witnessed the decline, saw what happened, and he talked, gave interviews, wrote a book, revealed things that shattered the carefully constructed legend. The exploitation, the manipulation, how people used Dali's name, signed his signature, created works he never touched, sold them for fortunes, all while the artist was alive, but too diminished to object. Or maybe he did object, maybe he knew. Maybe he didn't care anymore. The testimony was damning, but also complicated, because Sabater himself had participated, had been part of the system, had profited. His revelations were self-serving, protecting his own position, blaming others. The truth was murky. Everyone involved had something to hide. The Spanish government got involved, investigations, lawsuits, criminal charges in some cases. The art world watched nervously, because Dali wasn't unique. Other artists had similar problems. Picasso, Chagall, Miro, anyone famous enough to forge, anyone whose signature added value. The authentication crisis spread. Collectors panicked. Museums questioned their collections. Auction houses implemented stricter verification. Insurance companies demanded provenance. The entire market shifted, became more cautious, more skeptical, more litigious. Dali had always pushed boundaries. Now his legacy was pushing the boundaries of art commerce itself. Meanwhile, the critical reassessment continued. Scholars dug deeper, found letters, diaries, sketches, unpublished writings, built a fuller picture. Not the showman, the actual artist. What emerged was more complex than the public persona, more thoughtful, more deliberate. The clowning had been calculated, the outrageousness strategic. Behind the moustache was a serious mind, someone who read philosophy, studied science, understood art history deeply, used classical techniques with virtuoso skill. The early surrealist works held up, no question. The persistence of memory, the burning giraffe, the metamorphosis of Narcissus. These were masterpieces, revolutionary, influential, important. But the later work, the religious paintings, the nuclear mysticism, the portraits, these were harder to evaluate. Some critics saw them as failures, selling out, abandoning innovation for commercialism. Others found them interesting in different ways. Not surrealist exactly, but something else, a unique vision. Dali's own synthesis, classical technique applied to metaphysical subjects, nuclear age anxieties rendered in Renaissance style. Maybe that was valuable, maybe that mattered. The debate continued, still continues, will always continue, because that's how art works. Each generation reevaluates, finds new meanings, discards old interpretations. The work remains. Everything else is conversation. His influence on popular culture was undeniable. Film, television, advertising, fashion, music videos, video games. The visual language of surrealism had leaked into everything. Dream sequences in movies looked Dalian. Album covers borrowed his imagery. Commercials used his techniques. He'd wanted to reach beyond galleries, wanted his vision everywhere. He'd succeeded completely. His images were inescapable, part of the cultural vocabulary. Everyone recognized melting clocks, even people who'd never been to a museum, who'd never heard his name. They knew that image. It had transcended art, become symbol, become meme before memes existed. The younger artists who followed had complicated relationships with his legacy. Some rejected him entirely. Too commercial, too theatrical, too problematic. Others embraced him, saw him as liberator, someone who proved artists didn't have to starve, didn't have to choose between art and money, could have both, could be successful, could play the game. The feminist criticism grew louder. His treatment of Gala, his depictions of women, his attitudes, all of it was examined, challenged, condemned, and rightly so. He'd objectified, fetishized, reduced women to symbols. His misogyny was documented, undeniable. This complicated the legacy further. made it harder to celebrate uncritically. The work remained powerful, but the man who made it, the attitudes he held, the things he did and said, these couldn't be ignored, shouldn't be ignored. The full picture had to include everything: the genius and the ugliness, the innovation and the exploitation, the art and the artist. In 2017, something unexpected happened. Scientists exhumed his body. DNA test, paternity suit. A woman claimed to be his daughter, said her mother had an affair with Dali in the 50s, wanted proof. The Spanish courts ordered exhumation. His body was removed from the crypt, tested. The results came back negative. Not his daughter. The body was reburied. The museum closed briefly, reopened, life continued. But the incident was telling. Even in death, even decades after dying, Dali couldn't rest, couldn't escape controversy, couldn't stop being news. His moustache was intact. The morticians had preserved it, perfectly waxed, still pointing upward, still defying gravity, still recognizable. That detail went viral. Of course it did. The perfect Dali story. Even death couldn't defeat his moustache. Even the grave couldn't diminish his style. The legend continued. The market eventually stabilized. Authentication became more rigorous. Databases improved. Scientific analysis advanced. X-rays, infrared imaging, pigment analysis, carbon dating. The tools got better. The fakes got easier to spot. Not all of them, but more than before. Collectors could buy with more confidence. The prices reflected this. Authenticated works sold for tens of millions. The persistence of memory would be priceless if it ever came to market. The Museum of Modern Art would never sell, but experts estimated its value at hundreds of millions, maybe more. A single painting, 90 years old, still commanding that kind of attention, still worth that much, because it changed things, because it mattered, because it endured. The smaller works, the prints, the drawings, these varied wildly. Some were valuable, others worthless, depended on authenticity, on quality, on provenance. The market had learned, become sophisticated, become careful. But people still bought, still collected, still wanted to own a piece of that vision. His influence on surrealism itself was permanent. He hadn't founded the movement. Breton had done that. But Dali had defined it, given it its visual language, its most memorable images, its popular appeal. When people think surrealism, they think Dali. Not Ernst, not Magritte, not Miro. Dali. That's the name, that's the face, that's the moustache. He'd won that battle, become the movement's ambassador, its brand, its symbol, even though the movement had expelled him, even though he'd rejected their politics, even though he'd gone his own way. He was still the surrealist, the definitive surrealist, the one everyone remembered. The museum in Figueres kept growing, expanding, adding wings, incorporating neighbouring buildings, more exhibition space, more visitors, more revenue. The foundation that ran it became wealthy, powerful, influential. They controlled his image, licensed his name, managed his legacy, made decisions about what was authentic, what mattered, what got shown. It was exactly what he'd wanted, an institution built around him, perpetuating his vision, keeping him alive, keeping him relevant, keeping him everywhere. The younger generation discovered him through different channels, not museums, not books, social media, Instagram, TikTok. His images were shareable, visually striking, memeable. The melting clock showed up everywhere, edited, remixed, repurposed, used to comment on time, on deadlines, on existence, the elephants, the tigers, the draws in bodies, all of it got recycled, recontextualized, given new meanings. He would have loved it. This was immortality in the digital age, not just hanging in museums, living in feeds, spreading virally, being seen by billions, being used, being transformed, being part of the conversation, the estate ride to control it. threatened lawsuits, demanded licensing fees, but the internet doesn't work that way. The images had escaped, belonged to everyone, belonged to culture. Copyright meant nothing when anyone could screenshot, could share, could remix. Dali had become public domain in practice, if not in law. His face was still everywhere, the mustache still iconic. T-shirts, posters, Halloween costumes, coffee mugs, phone cases, stickers. The merchandising never stopped, never would stop. He'd become timeless, not through critical acclaim, not through academic study, through ubiquity, through being impossible to avoid, through images so strong they'd infected everything. That's the real legacy, not the paintings in museums, not the prices at auction, not the scholarly articles, the images in people's heads, the ideas that spread, the influence that never ends. He'd wanted to be unforgettable. Mission accomplished. Salvador Dali, the man who painted melting clocks, who wore an absurd mustache, who married Gala, who lived in Catalonia, who died in his museum, who changed art, who sold out, who succeeded, who failed, who mattered, still matters, will always matter, because the work persists, because the images endure, because he showed us something about dreams, about time, about reality, about how nothing is quite what it seems, how everything melts, how the solid becomes liquid, how the unconscious surfaces, how the impossible becomes possible. That's what he gave us. Not answers, questions, not certainty, confusion, not clarity, ambiguity, but beautiful ambiguity, disturbing ambiguity, ambiguity that makes you look closer, think harder, see differently. The elephants still walk on spider legs, the tigers still leap from impossible places, the clocks still melt, the dreams still disturb, and somewhere in Catalonia, in a crypt beneath a geodesic dome, beneath the feet of tourists, Salvador Dali rests, his mustache preserved, his legacy complicated, his influence everywhere, exactly as he planned. Almost. Because nobody plans everything. Nobody controls their legacy completely. Not even Dali. The work lives on, changes, evolves, means different things to different people. Gets reinterpreted, gets challenged, gets celebrated and condemned, gets analysed and merchandised and memed, gets reduced to a mustache and melting clocks, gets expanded into philosophical treatises, gets both oversimplified and overcomplicated, gets forgotten by some, discovered by others, gets praised, gets criticised, gets bought and sold and forged and authenticated, gets hung in museums and printed on t-shirts and shared on social media, gets everything he wanted and things he never imagined. That's what happens when you make something that matters. When you create images powerful enough to outlive you. When you change how people see. When you crack open the door between conscious and unconscious and let everyone peek through. The door stays open, other artists walk through, the influence spreads, the revolution continues, and you become part of history, part of the story we tell about art, about the 20th century, about surrealism, about Spain, about genius and madness and the thin line between, about what's possible when someone refuses to be limited, refuses to choose, refuses to fit into categories. Salvador Dali did that, made that choice, lived that life, created that work, left that legacy, for better and worse, for all its complications, for all its contradictions. It endures. The cathedral in Figueres sees 1,000 visitors every day. They line up outside, buy tickets, walk through rooms filled with his work, stand over his grave without knowing they're standing over his grave, take photos, post them online, move on to the next exhibit. Most of them know 3 things about Salvador Dali. The mustache, the melting clocks, the madness. That's the brand. That's what survived. That's what the world kept. But here's what they're actually looking at. Evidence of a man who spent 84 years trying to prove he existed, who painted nightmares to make the invisible visible, who turned fear into technique, who weaponized his own strangeness until it became armor. The dead brother never went away. That photograph on the wall, that name he inherited, that ghost he could never escape, everything he painted was an attempt to answer one question. Am I real, or am I just a replacement? The melting clocks weren't about time. They were about certainty dissolving, about solid things becoming unreliable, about the moment you realize nothing is permanent. Not even yourself, especially not yourself. Gala understood this. She saw a terrified child pretending to be a genius, and she said, "Yes, I'll help you pretend. I'll manage the performance. I'll make sure you never have to stop." And he loved her for it, needed her for it, couldn't survive without her. When she died, he had nothing left to pretend for. The performance ended. The curtain fell. What remained was just an old man in a castle waiting to die. No mustache could save him from that. The art world moved on decades before he died. Abstract expressionism, pop art, minimalism, conceptual art. Each movement declared the previous one dead. Dali became a relic while he was still alive, a museum piece walking around giving interviews. But the images didn't die. The elephants on spider legs, the tigers leaping from pomegranates, the burning giraffes, the drawers in human bodies. These things wouldn't go away. They'd infected too many minds, spread too far, become part of how we see. That's the paradox. The man became irrelevant, the work became eternal. He wanted both. Got one? Maybe that's enough. The authentication battles will continue forever. The market will keep finding new fakes. The estate will keep fighting. The lawyers will keep billing. The scholars will keep debating. Was he a genius or a con artist? A visionary or a sellout? A revolutionary or a regression? All of it. None of it. The questions are boring because they assume there's an answer. There isn't. He was too contradictory, too deliberate in his contradictions, too aware of what he was doing, too lost in his own performance to ever find solid ground. What matters is simpler. He showed us that dreams have structure, that the unconscious follows rules, that madness can be rendered with mathematical precision, that technique and vision aren't opposites, that you can be both classical and revolutionary, both serious and theatrical, both artist and brand. He proved you don't have to choose. You can have the melting clocks and the Cadillac full of cauliflower, the crucifixions and the chocolate commercials, the museum and the mustache, the genius and the sellout, the art and the con, all of it simultaneously, all of it true. The price was everything. His relationships, his integrity, his peace, his final years watching his body fail while his mind dissolved, dying slowly in a castle, then a hospital, then a tower above his own museum, surrounded by tourists who came to see the legend, not knowing the legend was upstairs dying. But he'd made his choice decades earlier, decided that being unforgettable mattered more than being happy, that fame mattered more than truth, that the mythology mattered more than the man. He built the trap himself, then climbed inside, then locked it behind him. And it worked. He got what he wanted. Immortality, his name recognition, his images everywhere, his influence permanent. The melting clocks will outlive everyone reading this. The elephants will still be walking on spider legs when the last museum closes. The dreams will still disturb when the last critic stops writing. That's the victory. That's the cost. That's the deal he made. Salvador Dali, born into a dead brother's shadow, died in a museum of his own making, spent the years between trying to prove he was real by becoming as unreal as possible, succeeded completely, failed totally, matters forever. The tourists keep coming, walking over his grave, taking their photos, buying their postcards, moving on, not understanding what they're looking at, not needing to understand, just knowing they've seen something strange, something that stuck, something that changed how they see even if they can't articulate how. That's enough. That's everything. That's what he was after, all along. Not understanding, recognition, not love, attention, not truth, impact, the ability to reach into someone's mind and rearrange something fundamental. Make them see the world slightly differently. Make reality feel less solid. Make certainty melt. He did that. To millions, to generations, to the entire visual language of the 20th century. The moustache is a joke now. The man is half forgotten. The scandals don't matter. The controversies fade. The prices fluctuate. The authentication battles bore everyone except the lawyers. But the elephants still walk. The clocks still melt. The dreams still surface. The unconscious still speaks. The boundaries still blur. The solid still becomes liquid. The permanent still dissolves. The real still questions itself. That's the legacy. Not the life, not the persona, not the publicity or the prices or the politics, the images, the things he made, the visions he pulled from wherever they came from and put on canvas where everyone could see them, where they'd stay, where they'd spread, where they'd infect everything that came after. He's buried under his museum, under the feet of tourists, under layers of mythology and merchandise and misunderstanding. Exactly where he wanted to be, exactly where he planned. The final performance, the last gesture, the ultimate publicity stunt, death as exhibition, the grave as installation, the corpse as artifact, the moustache preserved, the legend permanent. The man gone but the brand eternal. Salvador Dali, who painted melting clocks and meant it, who wore a ridiculous moustache and meant it, who declared himself a genius and meant it, who became exactly what he wanted to become and paid exactly what it cost. The work remains. Everything else is just noise, just commentary, just people arguing about what it means, what it meant, what it should mean, missing the point entirely. It doesn't mean anything. It just is, strange and disturbing and beautiful and calculated and sincere and false and true and impossible and perfect, all at once, all simultaneously, all contradicting itself, all refusing to resolve into anything simple, like dreams, like the unconscious, like reality when you look at it too closely, like time when you realize it's not solid, like identity when you understand there's no core, like everything Dali spent his life trying to show us. He succeeded. The proof is everywhere. In museums and on t-shirts, in textbooks and on Instagram, in the visual language we all use without knowing where it came from, in the way we see dreams, in the way we think about time, in the way we accept that nothing is quite what it seems. That's immortality, not the name, not the fame, not the prices or the prestige, the ideas, the images, the influence that spreads invisibly through culture until it becomes part of how everyone thinks, without anyone remembering where it started. Salvador Dali, the man who painted his way out of his dead brother's shadow, who turned fear into technique, who made madness systematic, who proved genius and calculation aren't opposites, who showed us that the unconscious has structure, who demonstrated that dreams follow rules, who revealed that reality is negotiable if you're brave enough or mad enough or desperate enough to question it, who spent 84 years trying to prove he was real, who succeeded by becoming completely unreal, who won by losing, who lost by winning, who got everything he wanted and nothing he needed, who matters, still matters, will always matter, not because he was good, not because he was pure, not because he got it right, because he showed us something about ourselves, about reality, about the thin line between genius and madness, about what happens when someone refuses to choose, refuses to compromise, refuses to be anything other than exactly what they are, even if what they are is a performance, even if what they are is a lie, even if what they are is impossible. The clocks keep melting, the elephants keep walking, The dreams keep surfacing, the work persists, the man is dead. The legend continues. The images endure. That's all there is. That's all there ever was. That's all that matters. The rest is just tourists walking over his grave, taking photos, moving on, carrying his images with them, spreading them further, keeping them alive, keeping him alive, exactly as he planned. Almost.